The eye in the closet. My aunt and uncle were the kind of people who lived like they had won the lottery, because in a sense, they actually had. Uncle Derek had built a software company from scratch in the late 90s, bootstrapped the whole thing from a spare bedroom in a rented apartment, and sold it at the precise right moment in 2001, before the dot-com bubble could take him down with it. They lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial in Westport, Connecticut, the kind of neighborhood where every driveway had a luxury SUV parked beside another luxury SUV, where the lawns were maintained by crews who arrived on schedule every Thursday morning regardless of weather, and where every backyard had a heated in-ground pool that got used maybe 4 weekends a year. I was 19 years old, working part-time at a sandwich shop, and the most expensive thing I owned was a gaming laptop I was still paying off. So when my Aunt Karen called on a Tuesday evening and asked if I would be willing to house sit for a long weekend while they took the kids up to a lake house in the Berkshires, I did not let her finish the sentence before I said yes. "We'll leave you $200 in cash on the kitchen counter," she said, "and obviously help yourself to anything in the fridge. The wine cellar, too, if you want. Just don't go crazy." The wine cellar. I had never been in a house that had a wine cellar. The only actual condition, the one concrete thing I had to do to earn this $200, was look after their dog, Bella. She was a Havanese, about 11 pounds, with long, silky fur the color of cream and a personality to match. I had met Bella at least a dozen times at family gatherings and holiday dinners, and in all that time she had never so much as growled at a stranger. She was the most laid-back, low-maintenance animal I had ever encountered. The care requirements were nearly embarrassing in their simplicity. Feed her twice daily, let her out into the backyard a few times a day, accept her affection when she offered it. That was the whole job. $200 for a weekend of living in a Westport colonial and occasionally refilling a water bowl. I showed up Friday evening with a duffel bag, a 6-pack of craft beer I definitely couldn't afford on my regular income, and the kind of barely contained excitement you feel when you're 19 and someone hands you the keys to their beautiful empty house. Aunt Karen had left a handwritten note on the granite kitchen island. Feeding instructions, the vet's emergency number, a reminder about the alarm code, a note about not running the dishwasher after 10 because the neighbors in the adjacent lot could apparently hear it. I folded the note into my pocket, opened a beer, and spent the first hour doing what any reasonable 19-year-old would do. Walking slowly through every single room of the house, like I was taking inventory of a life I intended to one day live. The house had a home theater with 8 leather recliners arranged in stadium seating and a projector screen that took up the entire far wall. It had a dedicated gym with equipment that still had the tags on it. It had a craft room that looked like it had been photographed for a lifestyle magazine, and then sealed behind glass, completely untouched. And it had a finished basement that was, without exaggeration, the greatest room I had ever set foot in. 2 enormous curved monitors mounted above a battle station desk, a racing simulator chair with a steering wheel and pedals, a mini fridge stocked with energy drinks and bottled water, and a shelf running the full length of one wall holding every major gaming console released in the past 12 years, organized by generation, each one connected and ready to go. I stood in that basement doorway for a long moment and thought, this is what success smells like. Bella had followed me on my entire tour without complaint, her small nails clicking a steady rhythm on the hardwood floors, her expression one of patient and slightly confused loyalty. When I finally settled into the gaming chair in the basement, she circled the rug beside me twice with the methodical deliberateness of a much larger dog, then lowered herself down and sighed in a way that suggested she had been waiting all day for someone to just sit still. I put on a headset, pulled up a first-person shooter I had been working through for weeks, and promptly lost myself for the next 2.5 hours. The house was silent except for the low hum of the monitors and the distant rattle of the HVAC system. The beer was good. The chair was perfect. This was the best weekend of my life so far. It was somewhere past 10 o'clock when I noticed something had changed. I wasn't looking at her. I was deep in a firefight, heart rate elevated, fully absorbed. But something in my peripheral vision registered as wrong before my conscious mind caught up. I glanced left. Bella was no longer in a relaxed heap on the rug. She was sitting upright, front legs rigid, her entire small body oriented away from me and toward the far end of the basement, toward the boiler room. The door to the boiler room was a heavy metal panel, always kept slightly ajar, leading to a narrow concrete space that housed the furnace, the water heater, and a network of pipes that produced their own unpredictable soundtrack of gurgles and clanks. I pulled off one side of the headset. Silence. Total silence. The HVAC had cycled off. The refrigerator motor was at rest. The only sound in the basement was my own slow breathing, and the absence of any other sound was somehow louder than noise. I told myself it was the pipes, the furnace cycling. A mechanical sound she had caught before I had, the way dogs do. I'd grown up with a shepherd mix, and I had watched him do this exact thing. The sudden rigid attention, the focused stare, every time a truck rattled the windows or the central air kicked on. It was completely normal behavior. I was being ridiculous. I told myself that. I said it internally in something close to an actual voice inside my head. Twice. But here is the thing about telling yourself you are being ridiculous. It rarely works, because the rational part of your brain knows it is probably correct, and the animal part of your brain does not care about probability. And both parts were in that basement with me. Bella was not looking at the door the way she looked at mechanical sounds. When the furnace kicked on, she might raise her head for a moment, glance toward it, then put her head back down. This was different. She was locked in, absolutely still, not scanning, not curious, not responsive to the normal cues that would pull a dog out of its focus. She was staring at that boiler room door with the quality of attention that animals reserve for things that are actually threatening. "Bella," I said softly. She didn't look at me. I paused the game. The basement went completely quiet. I looked at the boiler room door, the same 2-inch gap it had always been, the same darkness beyond it, nothing visible, nothing moving. I sat there with the controller loose in my hands, and I watched that gap for a full minute. Nothing happened. I exhaled slowly through my nose, the kind of deliberate exhale you do when you are trying to convince your nervous system of something your rational mind already believes. I unpaused the game. My character immediately walked into a wall because my hands weren't cooperating properly, and I died to an enemy I would normally have handled without breaking stride. I reset the checkpoint and kept playing. But I want to be honest about what the next 20 minutes felt like, because I think it matters. I was not in the game anymore. Physically, I was sitting in the chair with the controller in my hands and my eyes on the screens. But some essential portion of my attention had been permanently reassigned to that metal door and the 2-inch gap and the darkness beyond it, and it refused to come back no matter how many times I told it to. The game was happening in the front part of my mind. The boiler room was happening in every other part. And the boiler room was winning. My character moved through the level slowly and without conviction. I kept my headset off one ear. Every few minutes I glanced toward the door and found it unchanged. Same gap, same darkness, no movement. And every time I found it unchanged, I felt not relief, but a deepening of the specific unease that comes from not knowing whether you are watching for something real. Then she lifted her head again. About 20 minutes later, Bella's head came up again. She had put it down at some point. I hadn't noticed when, but now she was sitting upright again. And this time there was a sound. Low, barely audible, coming from her chest. Not quite a growl. More like a vibration she was trying to keep contained. A frequency broadcast on a channel that apparently only she and whatever was in that boiler room were tuned to. That was enough. I saved my game, shut off both monitors with a decisive double click, scooped Bella up with one arm, and took the basement stairs 2 at a time. I pulled the door shut behind me with a firmness that was entirely performative. Nothing on the other side of that door was going to be stopped by a door, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment under the bright, recessed lighting, breathing normally and telling myself I was fine. I was fine. I was completely fine. I was a 19-year-old man who had just been scared out of a dream gaming setup by a dog reacting to pipes, and I was not going to acknowledge how fast my heart was beating because that would make it real. The main floor had a separate entertainment room off a narrow hallway near the mudroom, Uncle Derek's designated man cave, though as with every room in the house, Aunt Karen had left her fingerprints on it in the form of decorative throw pillows and a gallery wall. It was smaller than the basement setup, with a standard flat screen and a current generation console, but it was bright and warm and had the significant advantage of being nowhere near the boiler room. I set Bella down, dropped onto the couch, and played for another 2 hours without incident. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. The guest bedroom in that house deserves its own paragraph. King-sized mattress with a pillow top layer. A weighted blanket so heavy it felt like being embraced by something that genuinely cared about you. Blackout curtains thick enough that when I switched off the bedside lamp, the room became the purest, most absolute darkness I had ever experienced outside of a cave. A sound machine on the nightstand with 12 white noise settings. I changed into gym shorts and an old t-shirt, made the executive decision to allow Bella up on the foot of the bed, a decision Aunt Karen would not have endorsed, and watched about 40 minutes of something forgettable on the ceiling-mounted TV before my eyes got heavy. Bella was warm and solid against my feet. I could feel her breathing slow into sleep before mine did. The last thought I remember having, as the TV timer shut the screen off and the room went dark, was that this was genuinely one of the most comfortable sleeping situations I had ever been in, and that I should try to appreciate it before I had to go back to my own mattress, which had a spring that occasionally made itself known at 4 in the morning. Then I was asleep. I don't know how much time passed. I don't know what specifically woke me. What I remember is consciousness arriving all at once, not the gradual surfacing of normal sleep, but the sudden, complete alertness that happens when some part of your brain has decided there is a reason to be awake right now. The room was dark. The sound machine was cycling through rain sounds. And underneath the rain sounds, there was something else. A growl. Low and continuous, coming from the floor beside the bed. I reached over and switched on the nightstand lamp. The light took a second to process. When it did, I saw Bella on the floor. She had gotten down from the bed at some point without waking me. Standing in the center of the room, her small body rigid and upright. Her head pointing at the closet. The sliding wood panel closet that ran the full length of the far wall. The closet I had opened earlier in the evening to hang my jacket, and had not fully closed afterward. It was open about 3 inches on the left side. "Bella," I said. I kept my voice quiet and steady because I was absolutely not going to panic in an empty house in Connecticut at whatever time it was in the middle of the night. She didn't look at me. Her growl deepened. The same contained directed vibration from the basement, but closer now and with something added to it. An edge. An escalation. I sat up in bed and stared at the closet, doing what I had done in the basement, running through the rational inventory. Old house. Natural settling sounds. A mouse in the walls. Almost certainly, these houses always had them. Bella responding to a smell I couldn't detect. The closet door sitting naturally in the carpet groove at whatever angle gravity preferred. All of it normal. All of it explainable. I got out of bed. I have thought about this decision many times in the years since. I was not being brave. I don't think it was bravery at all. It was something closer to the compulsive need to resolve uncertainty. The same drive that makes you check under the bed even at 30 years old, even when you know with absolute certainty that nothing is there. I needed to close the distance, look through the gap, confirm the darkness, and then go back to sleep. That was the entire plan. I crossed the room in slow, careful steps. The carpet was thick and noiseless under my feet. Bella tracked me with her eyes without turning her head, and her growl shifted in pitch. Higher, more urgent, aimed at me now as much as at the door. As if she was trying to say something she had been saying for the past 4 hours, and that I kept failing to understand. I got to about 5 feet away, and I stopped, because something came into view through the gap that hadn't been visible from the bed. The crack in the sliding door revealed a narrow vertical strip of the closet interior. The dark inside edge of the door panel. The coats and hanging clothes pushed to the sides. The back wall of the closet in total shadow. And in the center of that strip, at exactly the height a person's face would be if they were standing just inside the door, tucked into the corner where the wall met the edge of the sliding panel, an eye, round, still, catching the lamp's light in the specific way that eyes do, that faint, wet gleam that is completely unlike any other reflective surface in the world, and aimed directly forward, directly at me. The rest of the face was lost in the shadow. There was no profile, no outline of a body, just that single unblinking eye, pressed to the gap, looking into the room, or looking at me. I didn't scream consciously. The sound left my body before any decision was made. It was involuntary and loud and came from somewhere very deep, and it died in that well-insulated guest bedroom without going anywhere. I grabbed Bella, and I ran. I didn't think. I didn't grab my phone from the nightstand. I didn't grab shoes. I went through the bedroom door, down the carpeted hallway, through the living room, through the kitchen, and my hand found the landline phone on the counter in the dark, by feel alone, because there was absolutely no scenario in which I was slowing down. I hit the front door, and I was outside on the flagstone in bare feet at 1:30 in the morning, Connecticut cold biting through my t-shirt. Bella gripped against my chest with both arms. I called 911. The dispatcher was calm and methodical and walked me through it, and I gave her the address and the alarm code and as much coherent information as I could produce, which was not much. I told her there was someone in the house. I told her I'd seen an eye in the closet. I stood under the porch light, and I did not go back inside. 2 cruisers arrived in under 5 minutes. 4 officers. They went through the alarm code, cleared the entry, and swept the house room by room. 1 officer, young, patient, deliberate, came and stood with me on the front lawn and asked me calm questions about my evening in the chronological order that statements are supposed to take. He was specifically occupying my attention. I understood that at the time, and I was grateful for it, because I didn't want to watch whatever was happening around the side of the house. they found someone in the pantry closet off the kitchen. I don't know how he got in. I don't know how long he had been there before I arrived Friday evening, or whether he came in after I did. I never saw him. I was kept inside the kitchen at the island with a glass of water, while another officer talked to me about local football until the all clear. When they told me the house was secure, I sat there for a long moment and looked at Bella, who had been calm since the moment we got outside and was now sitting between my feet on the cold tile floor, looking up at me with the patient, steady expression of someone who has been trying to tell you something for quite some time. She knew. From the basement to the bedroom, from the boiler room to the closet, she knew. And the closest she could come to telling me was to sit completely rigid and stare at the place where the danger was until I finally listened. When Aunt Karen and Uncle Derek came home Sunday afternoon, 2 hours ahead of schedule because Karen had gotten my call and they had driven back from the Berkshires without stopping, I told them everything from the basement to the closet to the flagstone steps at 1:30 in the morning. Karen sat across from me at the kitchen island with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She wasn't drinking, her expression cycling through things I won't try to name. Uncle Derek sat at the end of the island and listened to the whole account, without moving, without expression, the way he had once described listening to a difficult quarterly earnings call, as if the information needed to be received completely before any response was warranted. When I finished, there was a silence. Then he reached over and put his hand very carefully on top of Bella's head. "Good girl," he said. That was all. Just those 2 words, said quietly to an 11-pound dog sitting on the kitchen tile. But the way he said them, the weight behind them, the specific quality of gratitude that was too large to be expressed in any other form, took me about 3 years to stop thinking about. Bella's tail moved once, and she put her head back down on her paws. The dummy in the woods. I am not someone who frightens easily. I want to be upfront about that before I tell this story, because I think it matters for the way the events land. I grew up in Tillamook County in rural Oregon, deep enough in the Coast Range that our nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down, a gravel road, and the nearest town with a stoplight was 40 minutes away. I spent my childhood in dense Pacific Northwest forest, not the postcard version of it, with picturesque trails and interpretive signs, but the real version, the version that doesn't care about you, the version that absorbs light and sound and keeps both for itself. I know what those woods sound like at night. The owls, the deer, the raccoons methodically working through whatever they can find. The way a branch falling in the dark sounds like a footstep, and then doesn't. I know how light moves between those trees at night, and I know how the shadow works in the spaces the light can't reach. More importantly, I know the difference between the sounds that woods make on their own and the sounds that woods make when something deliberate is moving through them. What happened that December did not feel like any of that. Not the natural version, not the version I knew. My friend Marcus had to drive down to Portland over a long weekend. His parents had an anniversary party, the obligatory family attendance kind, and he asked me 3 days before he left if I could stay at his place and watch Bruno. Marcus lived in a small clapboard house set back from a gravel road about a mile outside the edge of town, with dense second-growth forest pressing in from 3 sides. Bruno was a 90-pound black Labrador retriever, broad-chested and perpetually in motion, with a bark that you could feel in your sternum from across a room. Marcus had no fenced yard, one of the ongoing arguments between him and his landlord, which meant Bruno needed to be walked, which meant going outside and into the trees, in December, on the Oregon coast, at night. Marcus left me a leash, old blue nylon, fraying near the clip in a way I noted but dismissed, and a single instruction. He pulls hard. Just lean back and hold your ground. He left Friday morning, and I arrived that afternoon with my overnight bag and an optimism about the weekend that felt reasonable at the time. Friday night was easy. Bruno was enormous and enthusiastic and pulled me down the road like a sled dog who had somewhere to be. But he was manageable, and the walk took us out about 1/10 of a mile before he did his business and we turned around. The forest on both sides of the gravel road was dark and cold and completely ordinary. We were back inside within 15 minutes. I fed him. We watched television. He fell asleep across my legs on the couch in a position that slowly cut off the circulation to both my feet, and I slept on Marcus's couch with the dog curled against my back. Saturday was different. By Saturday evening, I had decided to extend Bruno's last walk to tire him out properly. He had been restless all afternoon, pacing the house, requiring attention. And so, instead of the quick out and back of the night before, I let him pull me down the road and around the curve that took us past the property line and into the stretch where the trees pressed closest to both edges of the gravel. The sky was clear, and a half moon gave enough light to see by, but the shadows between the trees were deep and absolute, the kind that don't resolve into anything when you stare into them long enough. Bruno was at full extension on the leash, as he had been since we left the porch steps. I was leaning back at almost a 45-degree angle, both hands on the nylon, letting him drag me along at his preferred speed. Then, at a cluster of old Douglas firs maybe 50 yards past the last property marker, he stopped so suddenly I stumbled forward. I gave him time. Dogs investigate. This is normal. I stood with my hands in my jacket pockets, breathing clouds in the cold air, watching him circle the base of the nearest tree with the focused interest of an animal following a trail. Normal. Completely normal. Then he went rigid. The shift was instantaneous and total. From investigation mode to something else entirely. His head came up, ears flattened back, and his nose pointed into the dark wall of trees ahead of us and slightly to the left. Then the bark started. Not his regular bark. I had heard Bruno bark at the mailbox, at squirrels, at a neighbor's truck coming down the road. None of those sounded like this. This was lower, more resonant, continuous, and it echoed off the trees in a way that seemed to surround us rather than project outward. And he lunged. Not playful lunging, not excited lunging. He threw his full 90 pounds in the direction of those trees, with the kind of purpose that doesn't come from curiosity. I dug my heels into the gravel. I leaned back. I had both hands wrapped tight around the leash, and I could feel the frayed section under my right palm, the way the fibers had gone brittle from cold and wear. I felt it give before I heard it snap. One instant the leash was taut in my hands. The next, I was standing in the road holding 3 feet of nylon with a broken clip dangling from the end. And Bruno was a dark shape disappearing between the trees in the direction he had been trying to go for the past 30 seconds. I ran after him. I got maybe 15 or 20 yards into the trees before I had to stop, because there was nothing to follow. He had been swallowed by the dark completely. No shape, no sound of crashing undergrowth, no bark. Just the forest and the cold, and my own breathing and the flashlight on my phone casting a cone of white light that seemed to make the surrounding dark more absolute by contrast. I stood still and called his name. My voice came out wrong in those trees, too small, too flat, absorbed immediately by the undergrowth and the moss and the weight of the canopy overhead. I called again. And again. Nothing moved. Nothing responded. I told myself he had chased a deer. That was the most likely thing. A deer or a raccoon. Something that ran in a straight line and triggered Bruno's instinct to follow. and he would circle back once the prey lost him in the dark. Labs did this. Marcus had mentioned it, actually. Bruno had a habit of taking off after things and coming back on his own, sheepish and muddy. He knew where home was. He would come back. I held on to that explanation for approximately 4 minutes. After maybe 10 minutes of calling his name, I saw something pale at the edge of my flashlight's range, low to the ground, roughly dog-sized, set back against the root system of an old fir. My heart came up. Bruno was black, but maybe the light was catching his eyes, his teeth, something, and I moved toward it carefully, watching the shape for movement, for a tail wagging, for any sign of a 90-pound lab who was very glad to be found. It was a section of fallen birch bark, curved at almost exactly the angle of a resting dog, sitting pale and still against the dark roots. I stopped, looked at it for a moment, stood up straight and called Bruno's name again, into the dark. The trees absorbed it. Nothing came back. And then I heard the footsteps. They were coming from my left, moving through the undergrowth. Not scrambling, not the chaotic, multi-directional sound of a deer changing its mind mid-stride. These were deliberate, evenly spaced, heavy enough that each step produced a distinct compression of dead leaves and packed earth. 2-footed, moving at a pace that was neither hurried nor cautious. The pace of something that had nowhere in particular to be and no particular reason to hide. They were coming from my left, moving through the undergrowth at a deliberate pace. Not the skittering, irregular sound of a deer or raccoon. No small animal produces that. Specific weight and rhythm. These were 2-footed, slow, unhurried. The way a person walks when they're not trying to get anywhere fast, when they are simply moving. My flashlight swung left, and I saw nothing. Undergrowth, fern clusters, the exposed root systems of the old firs, the irregular geometry of forest floor that looks different every time you sweep a light across it. No figure, no movement. The footsteps continued at exactly the same pace. I turned off my flashlight. In the dark, without the competing input of anything visual, my hearing sharpened to a degree that felt almost uncomfortable. The footsteps were clearer, more defined. I could hear the specific weight of each placement, heel to toe, the same compression pattern on each step, unhurried and deliberate, maybe 40 feet away, maybe 35, not moving toward me, not moving away. Moving at an angle that was hard to read in the dark in those trees, with the way sound bounce between the trunks. Circling. That was the word that kept arriving. The 2 questions my brain would not stop producing were, does this person know I am here? And, does it matter to them one way or the other? I had been in these woods for 15+ minutes, using a flashlight and calling a dog's name at full volume. There was no version of events in which a person within 50 feet of me didn't know I was there. The question was purely whether they had been here first. I had been here for 15 minutes. I had been using a flashlight and calling a dog's name at volume. If there was a person out here, they had heard me. The question was whether they had been out here before I arrived, or whether they had followed me in. I started moving toward the road, slow, careful, placing my feet as quietly as I could on the forest floor. I was covering ground and making decent progress, and the footsteps maintained their distance for a while, and then they stopped. Not faded, not gradually lost. Stopped. Just gone, between one step and the next. I stood still for a moment. The silence was complete. No footsteps, no wind, no Bruno, nothing. That silence was worse than the footsteps had been. I started moving faster. I stopped being careful about noise and just moved, angling toward where I thought the road should be, pushing through undergrowth, my jacket catching on low branches. I was close. I could see the slight lightening of the sky above the road cut, the break in the tree canopy, when I nearly walked directly into a person standing motionless in the trees ahead of me. I stopped so fast I nearly fell over my own feet. The figure was maybe 8 feet away, man-sized, dark jacket with the hood up, obscuring everything above shoulder level, standing with their back to me, absolutely still, not moving, not reacting to the noise I had just been making as I came through the undergrowth. I did not breathe. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, long enough for every scenario to run through my head. A hiker, a neighbor, someone from town who walked out here at night for reasons I didn't need to know. Someone with worse intentions. A person standing in the dark in December in the Oregon woods who had heard me coming and was choosing not to move. "Hey," I said finally. My voice came out strange, thin and small, flattened by the cold air. "Have you seen a black lab? I lost my dog out here." The figure didn't move. No flinch, no head turn, no shift of weight. Nothing. I took one more step forward and reached out and put my hand on its shoulder. The shoulder was hard, not tense muscle hard, not heavy coat hard. Solid, unyielding, like the surface of a wooden door. I felt my hand register what my eyes had already failed to, and I stepped forward and around and brought up my phone's flashlight and looked directly into the hood. Nothing inside the hood. A length of wooden dowel had been run up through the back of the jacket collar, holding the hood erect. The jacket had been stuffed at the chest and shoulders with what looked like bundled newspaper and plastic bags, giving it the silhouette of a torso. The whole assembly was mounted on a stake that had been driven carefully into the ground between 2 exposed tree roots, positioned deliberately, carefully, with clear intent, facing outward into the forest, toward where I had come from. It was a scarecrow, a dummy, a fake human figure in real clothes, staked in the Oregon woods at night, facing the trees. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds processing this information. Then the next thought arrived, and it was unavoidable. And it reorganized everything. Someone built this. Someone put it here. Someone dressed a stake in a real jacket and positioned it in these specific woods facing this specific direction. And that meant the footsteps I'd heard were not an animal. I did not think about Bruno after that point. I ran. Back to the road, up the gravel hill, onto Marcus's porch. Inside, door locked. I stood in the kitchen with my hands on the counter and breathed for a long time. Bruno did not come back. Telling Marcus was a conversation I have replayed many times since, always finding new dimensions of how badly it went. He listened in silence. He thanked me for being honest. He went out for 3 weeks looking for that dog, driving the back roads, posting flyers, calling the county shelter every day. He never found him. That night after I called Marcus and the call was over and Marcus had gone quiet, in the way people go quiet when there is nothing left to say, I lay in his bed in his empty house and stared at the ceiling. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard, very faint, from the direction of the tree line, the specific rhythm of a dog's frightened bark, high and short and desperate. The sound a dog makes when it is alone and scared and wants to come home. I went to the window and pressed my face against the cold glass and looked out at the black wall of the trees for a long time. Silence. I have never been able to decide with certainty whether I actually heard something or whether it was guilt manufacturing a sound. I still don't know what that dummy was doing in the woods. I don't know who put it there or what they were watching for. I don't know what happened to Bruno. I've been back to that area exactly once since then, and I didn't get out of the car. The hand in the floor. There is a specific species of anxiety that comes with caring for someone else's deeply beloved pet. The stakes feel grotesquely out of proportion, like being handed someone's heart and told to keep it warm and unharmed for a few days, and then please return it in the same condition. I have felt this before, in smaller doses, but nothing in my experience prepared me for the particular, specific, suffocating pressure that came with watching my neighbor, Eleanor's dog. Eleanor lived alone in a narrow 2-story house in a small town in southeastern Ohio, set back from a quiet residential street behind a yard that was well maintained. In the way of someone who treats yard maintenance as a private discipline rather than a social act, she was in her early 70s, moved deliberately, and had an antisocial quality that was less unfriendly than simply self-contained. She had lived next door to my family for 6 years, and in that time, I could count on both hands the conversations we had exchanged. She kept to her routines, and she kept to herself. Her dog was named Rosie, a small white Bichon Frise, round and fluffy, with dark eyes that seemed slightly too large for her face, and a voice that she deployed constantly and without apparent restraint. Eleanor's relationship with Rosie was the most complete and uncomplicated love I'd ever witnessed between a person and an animal. Rosie was not a pet. She was the center of Eleanor's household, its organizing principle, the thing around which everything else arranged itself. When Eleanor had to travel across the state to spend 3 days with her sister who had just come out of a medical procedure, and when the travel arrangements proved incompatible with bringing Rosie along, Eleanor came to our door and asked, with the seriousness of someone making a significant business proposition, whether I would be willing to stay at her house and care for the dog. I was 20 at the time, between semesters, and had nothing better going on. I said yes. She named a nightly rate that was more than generous. She walked me through the instructions for 45 minutes. The feeding schedule down to the quarter hour. The water bowl placement. The specific corner of the yard Rosie preferred for her outdoor business. The thermostat settings for day versus evening. The television channel that Rosie found calming, which turned out to be a 24-hour nature documentary station. I wrote everything down, and Eleanor watched me write it down, with an expression that made clear she considered my note-taking a necessary formality rather than an adequate guarantee. At the front door, she paused. "The spare bedroom is made up for you," she said. "Everything you need is in there." She looked at me steadily. "My bedroom is private. Please don't go in." "Of course," I said. "I mean it," she said. "I understand," I said. She nodded once and left. The spare bedroom was small and scrupulously clean. A single twin bed with a white coverlet pulled tight, a desk with nothing on it, and a window with thin curtains that let through the gray afternoon light in a way that made the room feel like the inside of an overcast sky. I put my bag on the desk chair and went out to meet Rosie, who was waiting in the hallway with the expectant, slightly accusatory expression of a dog who was aware that things were not normal and was reserving judgment. Rosie and I reached an understanding by dinner time that was functional, if not warm. I fed her on schedule. I let her out in the designated corner of the yard. I kept the nature documentary station on at a moderate volume. She yapped at me whenever I moved rooms unexpectedly, which was often, and I told myself this was simply her communication style. Eleanor's television was not compatible with any of my equipment, so I spent the evening on my phone and tried not to think about how much I would have preferred to be anywhere with a more modern entertainment setup. I did, I admit, walk briefly past Eleanor's bedroom. The door was open. I could see the heavy, dark furniture, the wardrobe, the four-poster bed. In the center of the room, taking up most of the floor space, was a large rectangular rug with a pattern of geometric shapes in deep red and blue. Intricate, old-looking, the kind of thing that probably had a specific cultural name I didn't know. I didn't go in. I kept walking. I was in bed by 9:30, which felt embarrassingly early but accurately reflected how little there was to do in that house. Rosie had apparently retired to Eleanor's bedroom for the night, which I was fine with. The house settled into a very specific kind of quiet, old building quiet. The quiet of a structure that has held decades of sound and absorbed them into its walls and now produces only its own faint internal music, the tick of radiators and the groan of floorboards. I fell asleep quickly and slept well for a while. The barking woke me at 12:40. I know the exact time because my phone screen was the first thing I focused on when I woke up. That automatic reach that has replaced looking at a clock. The barking was Rosie, unmistakably her particular high register. But something was wrong with the sound. It was muffled, directionally strange, and it was coming from somewhere that didn't match the layout of the house as I understood it. I lay still and listened, mapping it. Eleanor's bedroom was directly across the narrow hallway from the spare room. The kitchen was at the back of the house. The living room was at the front. The barking was coming from Eleanor's bedroom, yes, but not from the bedroom itself. From below the bedroom, from some space underneath the floor of Eleanor's bedroom that I had no knowledge of and no reason to believe existed. The house sat on a slab foundation. I had seen no basement entrance, no exterior bulkhead door, no interior access point to any lower level. There was no basement. I was sure of it. And yet, I got up. I walked to Eleanor's bedroom door. I stood outside it for a moment, my hand on the doorframe, thinking about her instructions. Then Rosie barked again, a sharp, urgent, frightened sound, and I opened the door. The nightlight near the baseboard gave enough light to see by. Eleanor's furniture was just as I had glimpsed it. Heavy, dark, antique. The wardrobe, the four-poster bed, the rectangular rug with its geometric pattern in the center of the room. The rug had been pushed to one side, shoved toward the corner of the room, piled against itself, exposing a rectangle of bare floorboard beneath where it had been. In the center of that exposed rectangle, a door, set flush with the floor, about 3 feet square, with a recessed metal ring handle. The ring was in the upright position, vertical, as if it had just been pulled and then released. The door was open about 4 inches, propped on its own weight against the edge of the frame. Rosie was standing at the gap, her front paws at the very edge of the opening, barking down into the darkness below with the kind of sustained intensity that dogs reserve for things they genuinely believe are threats, not performance, not alarm, warning. I froze in the doorway. Every instinct I had was pointing in the same direction. Leave. Go next door. Get my parents. Call the police. Do not cross this room. Do not go anywhere near that opening in the floor. But Rosie was there, and I was responsible for Rosie. Rosie, I whispered. She stopped barking. She turned her head to look at me, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge, and then turned back to the gap. She was not going down there. Her strategy had shifted from auditory warning to guarding the perimeter. She was doing in the only way available to her exactly what needed to be done. I took one step into the room, and I heard something from below. It was not a mechanical sound, not the house settling, not a pipe or a furnace or any system the building contained. It was a human sound, breathing, or the specific displaced air of intentional movement in a confined space. Something alive, something aware, Something that had heard Rosie stop barking and was now in that sudden silence, waiting. I stood absolutely still for what felt like a very long time. The opening was dark. I could see the top edge of what appeared to be rough wooden steps descending into blackness, and below that, nothing. Whatever was down there was beyond the reach of the nightlight, beyond the reach of any light I had available to me. I took one step backward, toward the door, toward the hallway, and then a hand appeared. It came up from below the edge of the opening slowly, reaching from the dark, the fingers curling over the rim of the floor door from underneath. A man's hand, large, deliberate, gripping the edge of the frame like it had done this before. Emerging from the darkness beneath Eleanor's bedroom floor in the middle of the night like something that had been waiting down there for a very specific moment. I did not make a conscious decision to run. My body made that decision independently without consulting me, and by the time I was aware of having made a choice, I was already in the hallway. I did not take Rosie. I have carried that fact with me ever since. I went back for her. I told myself I would go back for her. But what I actually did was go down the hallway and out the front door and across Eleanor's front yard and up my parents' front steps in the dark at 12:50 in the morning without pausing, without looking back, without Rosie. I hit my parents' front door with both hands, and I did not stop until my father opened it in his bathrobe with the exact expression of a man who has been woken up and is now facing something that does not fit the category of normal parental concern. I was not calm. I was not coherent. I told him there was a room under Eleanor's floor, and someone was in it. And I know I said it in that order because I remember the look on his face at the words under the floor, the very specific recalibration that had to happen. Before the words made sense, he was on the phone with the police in under 2 minutes. I sat on the couch with my mother's hand on my back, and I thought about Rosie standing at the edge of that opening, guarding it with everything she had. And I felt something that I still cannot accurately name. Not quite guilt. Something worse than guilt. The specific feeling of having failed the creature that trusted you most. They arrived quickly. 2 officers in a single cruiser, and they were good about it. Professional and unhurried in the way that small-town police in quiet neighborhoods are trained to be when the call is possible intruder, and the caller is a 20-year-old sitting on their parents' front steps at 1 in the morning. They went through Eleanor's front door with flashlights after I gave them the spare key from the hook by our kitchen door, and they cleared the house room by room. It took about 20 minutes. Then they went into Eleanor's bedroom. One of the officers came back to talk to me after. He had a measured, careful quality when he spoke, the kind of deliberately neutral expression that people in his line of work develop as a professional tool. He told me they had found the rug back in place and the floor door closed. He said this in the particular tone of a person reporting a fact they find interesting, without being ready to commit to why. They opened the door anyway, he told me. Procedure. Below Eleanor's bedroom floor was a crawl space, low-ceilinged, running under a significant portion of the house's ground floor, much larger than you would expect from the modest square footage of the house itself. They had found furniture stored down there. Boxes, what the officer described only as various items in the careful phrasing of someone who had seen something he was not going to elaborate on with a civilian. Old things, things that had been there for a long time. No person. No Rosie. Eleanor came home the next morning. My father went out to meet her in the driveway before she could go inside. I watched from our kitchen window. He talked. She stood very still the way people stand when they are receiving news that is not a surprise, but that they had hoped to avoid. And then she was not still anymore. She was crying about Rosie, and she was saying something to my father, something that made his face go through several expressions I couldn't read from the distance. He came back inside. My mother was in the kitchen. She said it's been going on for years, he said, keeping his voice low in the way he did when he thought I couldn't hear, which I always could. The sounds from below. She knew about the space down there. He paused for a moment. She called them her troubles. She said the troubles make noises at night. My mother didn't say anything. Eleanor filed nothing with the police. She did not request a follow-up investigation. Within 3 months, she had sold the house, as is, to a buyer my parents never met. And she moved away to an address that was not shared with the neighborhood. I drove past that house for 2 years after that on my way to work. The new owners replaced the front door and painted the exterior and put in a new mailbox. Normal things, the kind of things you do when you are taking possession of a house and making it yours. I always looked at it as I drove past. I always drove a little faster. I think about Eleanor sometimes, about what it means to live alone in a house for years, to sleep every night in that bed, with that rug in the center of the room, with what was underneath it, and to call it your troubles and go on with your life. To choose every single night not to know what was making those sounds, or to know exactly what was making them, and to keep that knowledge entirely to yourself. What the dog knows. 3 different houses, 3 different dogs, 3 different nights that none of us, me, the dogs, or whoever was on the other side of those walls and floors and closet doors, will ever fully explain. And I've told these stories enough times now, to enough different people in enough different contexts, that I've started to notice a pattern in how people respond to them. Not to the horror of it, that lands the same way every time, but to the dogs specifically. People always ask about the dogs first, not what did you do or how did you get out, but what happened to Bella, and did they ever find Bruno, and what about Rosie? As if the animals are the thing that matters most in the story, which, I would argue, they are. I've spent a lot of time since these experiences thinking about what the dogs understood that I didn't. About Bella, who tracked the danger from the basement boiler room all the way up the stairs and into the guest bedroom, who sat rigid and growling at a sliding closet door in the middle of the night for a man she had no particular reason to trust to eventually finally listen. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't being erratic. She was being extremely specific. She knew exactly where the problem was, and she kept pointing at it until I looked. About Bruno, who heard or smelled or felt something in those Oregon woods that I could not perceive at all, and who responded to it with 90 pounds of absolute conviction. I have thought many times since that night about whether he was running toward it or away from it. Whether he went into those trees because something out there needed to be confronted or because something out there needed to be escaped. I never found out. I never will find out. But his certainty has never left me. The way he stopped being a dog I was walking and became something with a purpose, I couldn't understand. About Rosie, who found the open door in the floor and stood guard at its edge and barked into the darkness below until I appeared in the doorway, and who stopped when I said her name, and who looked at me with those large, round eyes, the way animals look at you when they have done everything they can. And the rest is your problem now. They all knew. Each of them knew before I did, completely and without doubt. They didn't have to work through the inventory of rational explanations first. They didn't spend 20 minutes talking themselves down from the ledge of their own instincts. When their senses produce the information, something is wrong, something is here, something is not as it should be. They processed it and acted on it immediately, with no apology and no second guessing. We are not built that way. We are built to rationalize, to find the interpretation that requires the least disruption to the story we want the night to be. It's just the pipes. It's just the wind. It's just a mouse in the walls. It's just the house settling. It's just an old neighborhood. These big trees make sounds at night. Just go back to sleep. That instinct serves us well the vast majority of the time. It protects us from 100 evenings of unnecessary panic for every one evening where something is genuinely wrong. But on the one evening where it is genuinely wrong, on the night when the thing the dog is staring at is real, that same instinct becomes the most dangerous thing in the house. More dangerous than whatever is on the other side of the door, because it keeps you standing still when you should be moving. Here is what I would have told myself before any of those 3 weekends, if I had known what was coming. When you are alone in someone else's house, and the dog stops sleeping and starts staring at something you cannot see, stop arguing with yourself. Stop building the case for why it's nothing. You are not smarter than the animal that has been doing this for 40,000 years. You do not have better information than it does. It is not being paranoid. Get up. Get out. Take the dog with you. Call from outside. The $200 is not worth it. The cool gaming setup is not worth it. The weighted blanket and the king-size mattress in the nicest guest room you have ever slept in is absolutely not worth it. Get out of the house and ask your questions from a position of safety. I did not have that advice when I needed it. I learned it the hard way on 3 separate occasions in 3 separate states, all of them involving a dog who was trying as hard as it possibly could to tell me something I kept refusing to hear. Bella made sure I survived the first one. I have not forgotten that. I don't think I ever will. The others, I think about them differently. I think about what Bruno ran toward in those Oregon trees and whether he was brave or terrified or both. I think about what Rosie felt, standing at that opening in the floor in the dark, alone, barking at something I was not there to face with her. I hope they are both okay. I know that's a strange thing to say. I know the odds, but I hope it anyway.